What is the most popular sport in the world? Still further, what is the most popular game in the world? Some would say soccer, sorry, football, I'm American, and that answer would certainly be compelling, but what is the true answer to this question? Estimated by FIFA, a 2007 report suggested that over 250 million people around the world actively play football, while 3.5 billion people watch football. That is an incredible number and surpasses the American version of the sport by over 50 times. Widely cited as the most popular sport in the world, football is a household phenomenon, but how does it compare, in terms of player popularity, to games? The most popular video game in the world, right now at least, is Minecraft, having sold over 238 million copies. Assuming that each of these copies is purchased by a unique individual, and assuming that every single one of them maintains regular gameplay, which certainly is not the case, that would still fall secondary to a global football community. But what if I told you that there was a game, and a sport, that is far more popular than both Minecraft and football combined? Regardless of how we classify this particular activity, game or sport, chess is the most popular in terms of raw player metrics competitive activity in the world. Released by the AGON, estimated from statistics on YouGov, a report to the FIDE, the International Chess Federation, showcases that over 600 million players worldwide regularly play chess. This makes it one of the largest communities in the world, surpassing any and every video game, sport, or other technical game by extreme numbers. 600 million regular players is comparable to the entire active user base of Facebook, and while not all of these players will routinely watch tournaments or play at a tournament level at all, it is undeniable that chess is, by far, the most popular sport or game on planet Earth. Now, that's impressive, undeniably, but who within this enormous community is the most famous player? That title belongs, arguably I might add, to Garry Kasparov. Kasparov was a chess grandmaster who reached the number one position in the world during 1984, and held it, largely speaking, until 2006. Garry Kasparov, if not the greatest player in the history of chess, is one of the greatest names on a very short list, but in subsequent years after 2006, he has largely faded from the international spotlight. Alongside names like Bobby Fischer, often considered to be the most famous American chess player in history, Garry Kasparov represents an old guard of chess grandmasters that has long since given way to a new generation of players after training contemporary names like Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura. Within that new generation of players, very few names are comparable in both talent and celebrity status to that of Magnus Carlsen. Reaching his peak during 2014, Carlsen has gone on a more than 120-game win streak. He has been chess world champion numerous times, maintained the number one spot, and become world champion in 3 separate categories, standard, rapid, and blitz, while being the youngest player in history to reach a 2800 rating threshold. Hundreds of thousands of followers on various different social media platforms, a competitive position even now, and one of the most recognizable names in the history of the sport, Magnus Carlsen has achieved celebrity status in the community. However, with great popularity and monumental achievement comes controversy, because the world of chess during September of 2022, directly as a result of Magnus Carlsen's own actions, has been rocked by a cheating scandal, giving rise to one of the most chaotic whirlwinds of speculation that the sport has ever seen. I'd like to begin with the ignition point, if you will. Understanding that this could easily become a 2+ hour video with theory, research, clips, context, and explanations, I'm going to preface the actual information with a disclaimer of sorts. I know a fair bit about chess. I'm no expert, I'm not a master by any stretch of the imagination, but I know enough to muddle my way through some games and understand the bulk of terminology used at a professional level. I will be describing a series of events here in a connect the dots type video, but I make no assertions that these findings are definitive. Accusations are flying right now and may continue for quite some time over the legitimacy of certain players and their gameplay, but as it stands, there is no definitive proof. I certainly have my own opinion, which I will give at the end and clearly label when I do, but nothing contained in this video is irrefutable or incontrovertible evidence that constitutes actual proof. In truth, this scandal may fade into history as an unsolved mystery, unless significant revelations appear in a timely fashion, making it both frustrating and fascinating to research. Without further ado, let's get started. The story begins with the Sinkfield Cup, which is an annual invitation-only chess competition taking place during 2022 in St. Louis, Missouri. The competition, by and large, was a very standard display, until a series of actions by Magnus Carlsen. Day 3, while using the white pieces constituting a theoretical advantage here, Magnus Carlsen was defeated by 19-year-old Hans Niemann. This was a tremendous upset, an unexpected result, and a tournament inflection point, because following this result, Magnus Carlsen resigned completely, with a cryptic tweet alluding to his inability to say anything more. This was rather strange, but things were just getting started. About 2 weeks later, during the Generation Cup, a separate tournament, Magnus Carlsen would once again face off against the rising 19-year-old Hans Niemann, this time resigning after just a single move in the game. That decision shocked the world of chess and made it clear that there was a definitive reason that Carlsen was avoiding Niemann. Speculation exploded, it absolutely did, even after his initial resignation during the Sinkfield Cup, but following this drastic new action, the narrative began to form, even more aggressively than it had before that point, that Hans Niemann was a chess cheat, and that Magnus Carlsen was somehow barred from exposing what he knew. Here is where the narrative splinters. Instead of a cohesive singular timeline, we have numerous different threads simultaneously, and to organize it best, I will run down a list of significant findings should one decide to pursue the topic, with a goal of uncovering whether or not Hans Niemann is a cheater. First and foremost, Hans Niemann is a cheater. At least, he was. Initially highlighted by another well-known chess grandmaster named Hikaru Nakamura, who we mentioned earlier as being trained by Garry Kasparov, there was a 6-month period on chess.com where Hans Niemann was barred from competition. This public statement on his livestream, I might add, led to further speculation, led to more drama, and very rapidly Hans Niemann was forced to respond. In a September 6th interview, Hans Niemann acknowledged two distinct situations. One, at the age of 12, he had used an engine during an official tournament to increase his skill level. This refers to the concept of using computer-driven algorithms that are far more talented at chess than any human being to augment your decision-making and improve your choices. It is highly unethical, yet highly effective, and Hans Niemann has done this in the past. His explanation was that a friend had been there with an iPad and that the friend had fed him such moves. He didn't know better, he was 12 years old, and he paid the price. But this explanation is difficult to believe when we consider the second situation. At age 16, 4 years later, during his budding streaming career, he was once again suspended from chess.com. The reason? Using an engine to advance his gameplay, so that, in his words, he could play against more difficult opponents, meaning that he was cheating in non-tournament games to artificially inflate his rank, thus competing against players he otherwise would not be able to. This presents a logical problem for any rational person, because the reality behind the act of cheating is not so clear-cut. Hans Niemann was caught cheating 2 times, but thieves and cheats are not caught on a 100% basis. Catching a cheat does not mean that the person has only cheated 1 time, it means that they have only been caught once. And we are now required, in order to believe Hans Niemann that these were 2 isolated, disconnected, and non-repeated events, that he only ever cheated twice, he was caught twice, and that was the end of it. Is it possible? Sure. Is it likely? You decide. Expanding on the topic, with a now self-admitted reality that Hans Niemann was, at one point, a confirmed cheater in the world of chess, we can look at his coach. Maxime Delugy, a coach for Hans Niemann, was caught and punished for cheating during 2017 and 2020 in his own tournaments. According to various leaked emails, he claims that his students were contributing to his play, screaming out moves in the classroom, and that one of them was using an engine, unbeknownst to him, thus yelling out extremely significant moves. He followed those moves through no fault of his own because he was unaware that this was taking place. Appealing the ban, he was allowed to make a second account and play outside the confines of cash prize tournaments, never to be allowed to compete in those again. And yet, years later, his second account was once again suspended for violating the chess.com fair play rules. A twice-caught cheater on chess.com coached a student who was found to be another twice-caught cheater, after a veiled accusation of cheating by one of the world's most famous grandmasters. All in all, the makings of a brutal scandal. Making things exponentially worse here, though, in the aftermath of this confession to just 2 instances of isolated cheating, chess.com itself responded on social media saying, quote, "At this time, we have reached out to Hans Niemann to explain our decision to privately remove him from chess.com and our events." This is for a 3rd time. "We have shared detailed evidence with him concerning our decision, including information that contradicts his statements regarding the amount and seriousness of his cheating on chess.com." End quote. A twice-caught cheater, coached by a twice-caught cheater, who claims that those 2 instances were the only example, was now being told by the organization that banned him for a 3rd time in the aftermath of these events that the extent of his cheating was far greater than what he had claimed publicly and far more serious. The evidence was beginning to stack higher and higher. Speculation continued to mount, and many in the chess community turned to his post-game interviews. Directly after beating Magnus Carlsen in a now world-famous upset during the Sinkfield Cup, Hans Niemann had said not once, not twice, but 4 times that by some miracle, he had looked up the precise moveset that Magnus Carlsen opened with and studied it the night before. This was interpreted 1,000 different ways, but once a narrative has gained momentum, it's very difficult to shake. Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura, who has well over 1 million social media followers on various different platforms, keep in mind, began commenting more and more and more. During this post-game interview, discussing the miracle of how he had studied this particular moveset the night before, Hans Niemann stated that Magnus Carlsen had used that moveset prior against a particular opponent in London during 2018. Grandmaster Hikaru publicly claimed that this was completely impossible. The opponent Niemann had cited wasn't even in London during 2018, and using ChessBase, a popular tool in the community, the composition that Niemann had cited as his reason to practice a response the night before didn't show up at all. Hikaru stated, "Magnus has never played the G3 Nimzo," end quote. And once again, any defense by Hans Niemann was disarmed at every turn. One final and very substantial development came late in September, a few weeks after the initial controversy. Published by a creator named Yosha, a video began to go viral in this particular community at least, where Hans Niemann's various different games had been compared to engine performance. This video does not claim to be proof of cheating, but in the description it states, quote, "a new set of extremely compromising evidence against Hans Niemann," end quote. That's very interesting, but what does it contain? The video is a statistical analysis of engine correlation created by a user named GambitMan, and through this engine correlation tool, it is shown that Hans Niemann had, on many separate occasions, a 100% correlation to what the engine would suggest, which was higher than any other player in the history of all of chess. Sustained periods of engine correlation surpassing even Bobby Fischer at the height of his prime. Numerous tournaments with games that seemed to be purely dictated or correlating to engine decisions, and this video presented a wide range of statistical evaluations, painting a very, very damning picture. What's more, Grandmaster Hikaru reacted to this video, catapulting it to more and more people, with clips of this reaction gaining hundreds of thousands of views with definitive titles, and an ultimate effect where this analysis became assumptive proof for a vast majority of the chess community that Hans Niemann was guilty. And with that, the coffin appeared to be sealed. Publications that wanted to paint Hans Niemann as a cheater had any and every ability to do so. Inversely, critics of Magnus Carlsen, intent upon denying the situation, could point to a lack of definitive proof or entrench themselves. But the battle lines were drawn deep in the sand of a now worldwide chess scandal. However, that's not how I operate, and having told one side of the story so far, let's tell another. The case against Hans Niemann revolves around 3 core principles. 1, he has cheated before multiple times, and Chess.com has refuted his claims that it was isolated and insignificant. 2, his explanation for why he used a particular moveset was wrong and could not possibly be true because Magnus has never played the G3 Nimzo, as it's called. And 3, Hans Niemann has an engine correlation that is so far above any other player, with 100% games on many separate occasions, it is nearly impossible that anyone could have ever played that well for such an extended period of time. The only other person on record had a 98% correlation to the engine and was a confirmed cheater. These 3 pillars hold up the entire case, but what if they were wrong? Hans Niemann is not a likable person. His attitude is horrible. He shows blatant disrespect to opponents, arrogance in his interviews, and smug reactions. But what if he actually could form a defense? No one seems to be doing it. No one with a platform seems to be pushing for equal coverage. So right now, in response to what is arguably one of the biggest controversies in chess possibly ever, I want to round out this video with everything I found, not just a slanted narrative that could get me the most clicks. Pillar number 1 stands tall as unassailable. Hans Niemann admitted to it. Chess.com said it was even more severe. This pillar is immovable and steadfast. Judge him how you will, it is the strongest part of a critic's argument, and I want to be clear that the reality of his cheating is unflinching. However, pillars 2 and 3, well, let's have a look. Catapulted to mainstream opinion by Hikaru Nakamura, claiming that Magnus has never played the G3 Nimzo, it turns out that he actually has. It wasn't in 2018, and it wasn't against the opponent that Hans had said, but Magnus Carlsen did play a G3 Nimzo by transposition. It occurred in 2019, and when we realized that the mainstream narrative right now is that he invented an explanation in his own mind for his moves based on a pattern Magnus had never played, it becomes a bit less convincing if the reality transforms into he misremembered where and when Magnus had played it, but he has played it. Still, Pillar 2 remains as an object that viewers might latch onto, so let's move on to Pillar 3. Hans Niemann has an engine correlation so high it cannot be real. This is suggested as the most damning piece of evidence. This one is fascinating because, to delve into it, we need to know how the engine correlation is calculated by ChessBase. Having checked for myself through all of the games in the statistical analysis video by Yosha, someone made an excellent tool online to do that as well, making it significantly easier for me. It does appear that Hans Niemann has multiple instances of 100% correlation. But why? In order to calculate engine correlation, Chessbase draws from many separate engines. The idea is that if even one of those engines prefers a given move as the 100% best option, that would be perfect correlation. But this means that if you have, say, 4 engines instead of 1 in the reference pool, it is far more likely that a game can be 100% correlated, even if those engines disagree on certain moves. In simple terms, if just one engine has 100% correlation after 45 moves, that would be totally absurd and indicate that there is almost certainly someone feeding moves to the player directly from that particular engine. This is something partially echoed by the now viral reaction by Hikaru Nakamura, where a 45-move game by Hans has 100% correlation, and his reaction is one of total disbelief, and rightly so. However, if 100 engines are being used, as an example, each with their own idea of what the perfect move is, making different decisions on different computers, because Chessbase engine correlation is an open source project, the likelihood that a player's move receives a 100% correlation over the course of the game is 100 times higher. It appears to be, highlighted by a Reddit post from user Gistia, that Gambit Man, the one responsible for composing this data and giving it to YouTuber Yosha, is a contributing member for the analysis data on Chessbase, whose contributions and parameters are solely responsible for multiple of these 100% correlation games, effectively expanding what engines are used in the process, modifying how they react to data, and any change that he or the community chooses to make can completely redefine the output, making it so that there is just one or dozens of perfectly correlated games, but that result cannot necessarily be trusted. Furthermore, engines learn over time, and it's a very, very complicated process that leads to this, but the fact that the community is so invested and so many people are plugging in this data and looking at all of these games over and over and over again can lead the engine to have a higher correlation to certain outcomes. It's a very complicated thing, but what we might have here is a positive feedback loop where all of the investigation is leading to more and more engine correlation outputs against Hans Niemann. I'm not saying it's what's happening, but it's possible. In fact, to dig a little bit deeper here, even with just one move determined by one engine, multiple of the games by Hans Niemann that were analyzed would have dropped to just 86% correlation, in line with high-level examples from innumerable other chess masters. What's more, the now viral video on YouTube, the reaction to this engine correlation evidence by Hikaru Nakamura, cuts off in the middle of his subsequent evaluation. Why? It turns out just a few minutes later, the game that Hikaru Nakamura selected for testing had 100% correlation for his moves to the engine. This example didn't make it into the video though. It didn't make it nearly as far as the shocked commentary on how unlikely it is that Hans Niemann would ever have such correlation, but it further builds skepticism that all might not be quite as it seems. Of course, YouTuber Yosha has refuted this claim and stated that she still believes Hans Niemann to have a higher correlation by far than any other chess player in existence or history, maintaining her skepticism and stance. But if our goal is to be thorough, we need to be at least aware of these opposing stances. As the controversy continued to explode, Professor Ken Reagan, a world-renowned expert in the field, says he analyzed all of Hans Niemann's games, online and offline, over the past 2 years, categorically stating that no cheating has occurred. In a public interview, he discussed his method without revealing anything definitive, but his expertise in the field is widely known. This public stance and statement contributes to a completely divided landscape. Some believe that Magnus Carlsen would only make such statements and decisions with certainty. Others believe he is just a sore loser. Some grandmasters and media publications believe that Hans Niemann is a stone-cold cheat, and others think that he is the scapegoat of a bitter world champion who's having his life effectively ruined. One player even came out, Grandmaster Fabiano Caruana, stating that he knows for a fact, quote, that renowned Professor Ken Reagan's method is completely flawed, because he had once cleared a player, the method at least, whom he knew for a fact to be guilty. And all of this combined paints a devastating picture for the chess community at large as it becomes more and more divided by the day. As per my initial disclaimer, nothing I presented is proof. We do not have proof at this time, but one thing remains clear. Community sentiment is largely against Hans Niemann. The viral content you find discussing the topic, highly critical of him and slanted always towards guilt. The more balanced perspectives are far less common, and while there are some players and experts defending him, the narrative appears to be largely established. In terms of my own opinion, I do believe that he has cheated far more often than he admits, at least more than he's admitted publicly so far. He likely has a substantial unknown history of unethical conduct in my eyes, but I find myself gravitating towards a mindset that he did not, in fact, cheat during this particular tournament. I would never place a bet on that outcome. I would never stake more than some idle words on this being correct, but my gut says, with a history of cheating far more explosive than what we know, Hans Niemann has cultivated a subtle reputation in the community. That reputation is possibly what caused Magnus Carlsen to have such a severe reaction to him. And if I were forced to make a complete guess here, Hans Niemann beat Magnus Carlsen in a legitimate fluke after studying frantically the night before, which ultimately paid off. Regardless, right or wrong, that's just my opinion. Hans Niemann is now seemingly a chess community villain. There is a widening gap between critics and defenders that deepens by the day, and it remains to be seen where all of it will go, but I thought it would be interesting to cover an explosive controversy in one of the world's largest communities. That's it. If you want to support, link down below. You can discuss in the comments whether or not you think he's guilty. Yeah, everybody's going to have their own opinion. A lot of them, a lot of different theories out there. But yeah, links down below like Patreon, locals, and other YouTuber to check out, etc., etc. But I'll cut there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching and have a nice night.